So does it take longer to develop in men, or do men not have the same role models? And maybe do they have different expectations that are given to them at an earlier age?
Right.
And maybe they're given messages like, don't cry, man up, boys don't cry, stuff like that. And then they don't ever get the chance to regulate with a calm and collected caregiver. And so they don't develop those tools.
So Jess, welcome to the Gents Talk podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Oh, I'm the excited one. I am not a dad yet. I'd like to be one day. But I have a lot of friends who are parents, and I obviously have parents. And I think there's a growing curiosity around parenthood and how to become good parents. You know, like my parents' generation of parenting is vastly different than what you hear and see today. And I was scrolling through some of your social posts and seeing some of the commentary in the comment section, but also seeing some of the stuff that you've talked about that I thought were very interesting. So firstly, why don't we start with who Jess is? For those who don't know who you are or just know you by your public persona, who's Jess?
Who's Jess? That's a really good question.
I always like putting people on the spot to start.
Yeah, I love that. I like being put on the spot. I think it's good. Usually I'm the one interviewing people, so I was excited to be interviewed today. First off, I'm a mom. So I have 3 girls, and they are 7, 4, and 2.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of my life these last 7 years have been motherhood.
Yep.
And it's been a real experience, like what you talked about. I was lucky enough to grow up with parents who were really involved and present and amazing parents, I think actually far ahead of their time in terms of how they parented me, which I feel really privileged to have. But even still, parenthood has been a journey, and it's been a constant adjusting and trying to understand how to best support my kids and who I want to be and my values. So that's one part of who I am. I'm also a registered psychotherapist. So before I even had kids, I was working with families, and I was working specifically in complex behavior. So I worked actually for the government. We're both from Ontario. I lived in Guelph at the time, and I worked for a government-run program where I worked with kids in the city of Guelph who often had dual diagnosis. So they would have intellectual disability and maybe another diagnosis, like mental health diagnosis. And these were kids that were often at risk of getting kicked out of school, maybe being in jail, maybe being on the streets, especially as they got older. And so my job there was to help with the complex behavior. So before I even became a parent myself, I was really deeply in this world of children and their behavior and understanding them. And then, of course, when I had my own kids, it was taken to the next level. But
real life experiment.
Yeah, exactly. It was a real life experiment, and so much harder. Like you think, oh, I've done this for years, it should be a breeze. No, it was not a breeze. But that's a huge part of who I am too. And I feel like I've been living and breathing child behavior and development for my entire adult life, which has been really amazing. And then who else is Jess? Jess is also a wife. I have my husband, Scott, who's a huge part of my business and part of my life and my best friend. So we've been married now for 10 years, which is exciting.
Congrats.
I want to talk to you about Portugal because I think, were you just there?
I was in Italy.
Oh, you're in Italy.
But I've been to Portugal before.
You have been to Portugal.
Yeah, I love it.
Oh, we're going there on a 10-year anniversary trip in a couple of weeks. So
that's exciting.
Yeah.
Have you been?
No.
Oh, you're going to love it.
Oh.
It's beautiful. The food's incredible. And even though you're converting from Canadian to Euro, you're still going to find it's very affordable.
Oh.
Yeah, you're going to have a blast. How long are you going for?
8 days.
8 days. Okay, that's a good Lisbon, Porto.
Yeah. Not Porto,
Oh,
Lisbon and Ericeira, and then we're going to go like along the coast and do the beachy stuff too.
Nice.
Yeah. Anyway, we're really excited.
Going on. This is now a travel episode.
Well, I saw you. Yeah, I saw you were in Spain. For some reason, I thought maybe you had just mentioned that you've been to Portugal before.
I had been, yeah.
How was Spain?
Incredible. Spain was incredible. So I was in Spain in November, and then my girlfriend and a few of our friends decided we want to take, when it finally, the vacation finally makes it out of the group chat, we decided we're going to go to Italy.
Okay.
And we just sort of found really great tickets and we just booked it and we made it happen. It rained for a lot of it, but honestly, it couldn't take away from the magic of it.
Oh, it's
yeah,
amazing.
It was beautiful. Europe is just a whole other experience, but I digress.
Yes.
Parenting today seems like a very, very, it's like holding a grenade. You know, depending on who you ask, everyone, you know, you really want to see a person's limits. You talk to them about their kids. When it comes to parenting, how you parent, the education system, values, morals, cultural biases, religious biases, all these different layers of complexities. As a psychotherapist who's worked with children, what's the biggest thing you've seen that parents these days should be more mindful of?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I feel like there's so many places that I could go. But I think one of the most important things that we can do as a parent is really understand kind of all these past experiences that bring us into being a parent. And reflecting, I think, is the number one thing we can do as a parent that is going to help us be the best parent possible. And what I mean by that is I think, like you said, like you grew up and your parents maybe had a different style of parenting than maybe you want to eventually. And a lot of people that don't take this time to reflect and repair kind of on those past wounds will repeat. So we'll repeat what we don't repair. And I think that that's one thing that our generation of parents is doing really well. Like we're actually, a lot of us are open to reflecting. And so even like I said, I had a good childhood. Like my parents were ahead of their time. They were very gentle. My dad was a very gentle father in a time when most fathers were spanking their kids and, you know, sending them to put their nose in the corner, whatever it was. He was very gentle. And I still have things that I need to reflect on in order to be the mom that I want to be for my kids. So I think reflecting on our childhood and then deciding what do I want to take away and what do I want to leave behind. I think that's the most powerful thing that we can really do.
You mentioned spanking.
Yeah.
Let's just jump right into that. So one of your social posts talked about a father who, when his son would do something wrong, he would go and speak to him, and then he would spank him as a means to make sure he understood this is not okay type of thing. I've had several conversations with people on this podcast who've talked about when they've grown up, they've been spanked at different times. And there's a fine line between being spanked and child abuse. Let's just make sure that that's clear. We're not talking that. But I've been spanked as well as a kid. And growing up now, when I do reflect and I look back on it, I must admit that I don't necessarily see the issues with when that happened to me. Because I did learn something from it. But I will admit that I've had conversations with people who've told me their stories, and I'm like, that's excessive. Where do you stand on that front? Why is it a good thing or a bad thing? And what's an alternative maybe to it?
It's such a good question. And I love that you brought up that you feel like you learned something. So before I answer, can I ask you to just share maybe one of your experiences with spanking and kind of what you felt like you learned from that?
Yeah. So I remember one day I was, I don't know, 7, 8 years old, something like that. And I was playing with my toys, and it was just my mom and I. And I had knocked something over, one of my Lego sets or whatever. They broke, and I just cussed out loud, like really loud. And my mom looked at me and she goes, okay, just wait till your dad's home. And I mean, that was fearful enough already. My father was more the disciplinarian. Always showed me love, told me he loved me, the whole works, never doubted it for a second. But he was the disciplinarian between the two. And when he came home, and my mom told him, he yelled at me, and then he spanked me once on my butt. And it wasn't like a beat. It was like what I would imagine today feels like doing one of these. But it was enough that it instilled this idea that if I did something like that again, that would be the outcome. And it was so few and far in between, as in like rarely did it ever happen. But that was the experience, and that was the lesson I'd say I took away from it.
So the lesson that you learned was not to swear or cuss when you were angry or upset?
Yeah. I mean, as a kid. I mean, I do it now.
Things change when we become adults. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I think that's such a great example. And that's the stories that I hear from a lot of people who are on the fence. Like, should I spank my kids or should I not? And what I like to say is yes. So sometimes in this scenario, you were spanked and you don't feel like it traumatized you, right? And so a lot of people I talk to, they were spanked growing up and it was traumatizing.
Okay.
Right? So for example, my husband was spanked growing up and it was done in a way that was very painful, like emotionally painful for him. And what I would say, even despite that, spanking still was maybe not the most effective way to teach you that lesson. And I would say I actually have a pretty hard stance against spanking.
Okay.
That would be probably the only thing. Like, I feel like there's a lot of gray area in parenting. And
I imagine the whole thing is a giant gray area.
It's a giant gray area. Yes, parenting is a giant gray area.
Yeah.
But I think spanking is one line that I really have. And what I'll say about that is because there's no research to show the effectiveness of spanking. So in the situation here where you learned a lesson and you did something new, there's a few things that are happening, but one of the big things is fear is what's motivating you to make that change, right? Yeah. The fear of your father, fear of getting hurt again. And so you're making a change, but it's not rooted in this understanding of why what you did was wrong or why what you did might not serve you or help you. And it's also not teaching you a new skill. So it's also not giving you a tool. So the next time you're angry and upset, you're going to do this instead. You're going to take a deep breath. You're going to talk to your mom about how you feel. So you're kind of left now as a child that's been spanked and fearful, but you don't have a new tool to deal with your anger.
Okay.
So now you're a child who's like, okay, I know when I'm angry, I can't swear, but I don't know what else I can do. And so what we often see in kids who are spanked is we might see them stop. So we might see them stop doing something like yelling or swearing or getting angry, but they haven't learned a new skill yet. So now when they're angry, they're still left with like, I have all these feelings inside of me and I don't know what to do. Yeah. So then we see that same child might go and start hitting their brother next time, right? And now, okay, how are we going to stop the hitting? We might spank them. So now we're going to spank them for hitting and okay, the hitting stops, right? So, it was effective. The hitting stops and they never hit again. Right. And now next time they're angry, they're kicking or they're calling names or they're running away. And so what can happen with spanking is it feels effective. It feels like the child never did this behavior again. But because we're never getting to the root and we're not teaching a new skill, we start to see this cycle of punishment happen and the child stops having a solution. They don't have a new way to behave. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So essentially they're just they find a different way to express that emotion until that emotion is essentially, or that way rather, that mechanism is ruled out, and then they go and they find another one and then just rinse and repeat the cycle.
Yeah, and the research actually backs that up. So they say that children who are spanked are often more aggressive or angry than children who are not. And so
I was an aggressive, angry kid.
Yeah. Yeah, tell me about that. So what was it like growing up like as an aggressive or angry child?
My aggressiveness and anger stemmed whenever something didn't go my way. If I got upset by something, I didn't quite know how to articulate emotions. I didn't know how to express any of that. My parents, did the best they could with what they knew.
Yeah, exactly.
And they grew up that way too. And a byproduct of that was also them coming to Canada from a civil war. So the last thing that, on their mind was, are we having a conversation with our son to make sure that he's able to express himself, or are we making sure that we put food on the table?
Exactly.
And that's, I think, the part where now as I get older, I reflect your point on these things and I go, I can understand limitations. But I can see how that would have generated some aggression. But I'm curious, as you speak about, communicating with the child to see how they can express themselves, at what age is it reasonable to expect them to be able to articulate themselves that way, right? Like at 7 years old, 8 years old, can you say to them when they do something wrong, can you sit them down and explain? Like, would they have the cognition to understand what you're saying to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So ideally what we want to do is actually start that when our kids are really little. So I have a 2-year-old and I'm already what I call narrating. So basically imagining like you're watching a sports game or something, how the sportscaster's like broadcasting the whole thing. Like, I don't know sports, so I can't even give you an The only thing we watch is Formula One. So that's the only thing I have. But we watch Formula One. Let's say we watch it every weekend and you hear the sportscasters, right? They're like Max Verstappen this or Lewis Hamilton this. And so it's the same thing that we want to do with our kids. We kind of want to just start by just sportscasting out what they're doing.
Okay.
Right? Like, oh, I see you hit your sister. Look at her face. Her face is really sad. When you hit, it makes your sister sad. So you start by just sportscasting it out and just saying what you see. And that actually helps a child start to make a connection between cause and effect. So I see that in my toddler. I'm sportscasting constantly in my house. Like, I'm basically always like, okay, Margot, I see that you hit your sister. And oh, look, her face is so sad. When you hit, it hurts. And she's starting to make these connections between her behavior and how somebody else feels. Or I'll say something like, oh, Margot, I see that you didn't get the red cup and you really wanted it, but I gave you the pink cup. Oh, you're so mad. And I'll just say what I see out loud. And so I'm starting to give her those connections. If we can do that starting from a young age, then typically between the ages of 5 to 7, we start to see a shift. And it's called the 5 to 7 shift. And what happens is that language that you've now given them in these early years of their development, they can start to take on for themselves. So my older child, who's actually 7, she can say, oh man, I really wanted the red cup and you gave me the blue cup and now I'm mad, mommy, because I've given her that language.
Right.
So ideally our kids between the ages 5 to 7, and for our more sensitive, like really sensitive, highly sensitive, deeply feeling kids, probably closer to 9, they should be able to start to have some logic and reasoning with you. And it's important to note that toddlers don't even have the capability to think logically.
Right.
So often we send them to timeout, or we give them a spanking, or we get
don't
angry
even
at them and they can't even understand.
Right.
Like their brain doesn't even have that capability.
At what age does that develop?
We
5?
start, around 5 to 7, we start to see the shift, but it doesn't fully develop into the early 20s. So we got to give our kids and our teens a lot of grace, because even our teens don't have a fully developed ability to think logically or reasonably or control their impulses.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So we could get into teens, but that's a whole other ball game.
Does it differ between, like, does the 20s piece differ between men and women? I know they make fun of guys and say it takes guys longer to figure things out.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think what it really comes down to is, have they had like children and youth and even young adults who've had the ability to be with a parent who can teach them these skills? It will develop faster.
Okay.
So does it take longer to develop in men, or do men not have the same role models? And maybe do they have different expectations that are given to them at an earlier age?
Right.
And maybe they're given messages like, don't cry, man up, boys don't cry, stuff like that. And then they don't ever get the chance to regulate with a calm and collected caregiver. And so they don't develop those tools.
What would the effects be on a young man who grows up being told those kinds of things? And then anytime those emotions are expressed or they do something wrong, there's aggression of some kind, whether it's emotional aggression or physical aggression towards them from a parent or an authority figure. How does that impact a person?
I think it impacts them in a really profound way. If you imagine that growing up, anytime you feel sad, anytime something doesn't feel quite right to you, and you express that, and then you're told you can't do that, or someone spanks you or gets angry at you, you learn to shut that down. And that's actually a defense mechanism. So a young boy is going to learn, I can't be sad. Sadness is wrong. So when I feel sad, I'm actually going to come across as angry, because angry is okay. Like, I'm allowed to be angry.
That's our default.
That's our default. Yeah. And so to put up a defense so that I don't have to feel sad, I'm going to come across as angry or mean or rude. And maybe these kids turn into like the bad kids in school, the ones who always get into trouble or into fights. And that's a defense mechanism. And really, when we look at anger, even in adults, often the root of anger is sadness. And we can't help even an adult who's struggling with anger issues until they can actually be sad and cry. And that's such a difficult thing, especially for men, when you grow up your whole life hearing, like, it's not okay to be sad. Dr. Gordon Neufeld, who's actually a Canadian researcher and one of my favorite people to look at in the child development field, he will say that sadness is actually the goal. Oftentimes when we want to heal a child who's angry, we actually need them to get to a place where they can cry and be sad. And I think the same is true for adults.
How do you do that as a parent? If you have a child who you know, and perhaps it's not something that you're doing as a parent. You're not trying to dismiss emotions. You're actually encouraging conversation, expressing the emotions. But for whatever reason, whether it's just their collective friends or the environment that they're in, they're suppressing that kind of thing. What route does a parent have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such a good question. Do you mind if I go back to your story
Absolutely.
about being angry? So if I imagine you angry as a child, can you explain the situation a little bit more before you were swearing? What was happening there?
I was playing with a Lego set. I think I'd spent whatever felt to me like a massive amount of time putting together this giant tower of some kind. And I think I had messed something up. And in order to fix it, I had to basically take it apart and redo it. And I got so mad that I just swore and I just knocked it over. And
Right.
it just exploded. And it felt good to do it.
Of course, it does feel good.
Yeah.
It still feels good to knock things over
Oh,
when you're
100%.
an adult.
That's why
and
they've
you're
got
angry.
smash rooms now for people to just go in and break things.
Yeah, I was gonna say now we just go to the gym and
Yeah.
we just work out there.
But yeah, that would have been the situation there.
Right. Okay. So on the surface, your mom comes in and you're angry, you're smashing things around and you're swearing and you're yelling. Here's what I would do in that situation. So I'd see you and I would see an angry child who's just broke his Lego set. And that's very, very frustrating. I would see you, I would come and I would get down right beside you and I'd be like, man, you're really angry right now. You broke your Lego set. That's really tricky. And you'd probably be like, yeah, F this and that. Like, I'm so frustrated. Like, yeah, it's super frustrating to break your Lego set. You tell me a little bit more about what you were trying to make? And I would just sit there and I would try and be really calm and regulated. And I actually wouldn't even talk about your swearing. I wouldn't even mention it. And I think that's something that parents struggle with because we don't like to hear kids swearing or being angry like that. But that's actually our own uncomfortable feelings towards them being upset. And that's why that reflection piece comes up, right? Because what does it say about me as a parent if my child's swearing or my child's angry or my child's upset? That actually has more to do with me than it has to do with you. So I would.
It's funny that we're gonna get back to that.
Okay, yes, let's get back to it. So I would sit down beside you and I'd be like, man, that's really tricky. It's really hard when your Lego set's broken. And what I think might happen, because I actually had the same thing happen with my 7-year-old this morning, not Lego, but a different thing got broken and she was having a similar reaction to you. And I would just sit there and I would just wait for you to join me on the floor. And what I think would happen was eventually, I think once all your anger was out, I think you would realize that you're actually just really sad. All the work that you did on that Lego is now destroyed. And now you have to rebuild it again. And I think underneath that angry reaction is actually someone who maybe needs to let out some tears about what happened that was really hard.
Right.
So I would wait for the tears and maybe they won't come out. And then I would talk about, okay, so that was really tricky. And this was hard. And then I would narrate again. I would say the whole situation that happened. And then I'd be like, I wonder next time when you're really angry about your Lego, what might be a more helpful solution? And then I'd brainstorm that. So it's just a different approach to a similar issue.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate for a moment.
Please.
There are people out there who would hear that exact piece of advice you just shared and go, that would create an adult who, we'll call them soft. That's the language that they typically use.
Yeah.
And that there's been a growing, and I admittedly don't know where I fall on the spectrum because I'm just like, I don't have kids, so I don't have the experience of going through that. But there are people who would call that type of response to kids soft because you're softening them. What would you say to that?
Oh, I love that question. I was just talking about that actually on Nurtured First the other day.
Great, let's get into it.
Because yes, I hear that all the time. Like, oh, this is going to turn them into snowflakes or they're going to be soft. And I guess I have two responses. First, is it okay that a child grows up and has some softness to them, right? Like, how are we serving, especially young boys or men, teaching them that they have to be hard from a young age? Like, we see high rates of mental illness. We see struggles with depression and anxiety. We see men who struggle to communicate in relationships. So is it serving us to harden them at a young age? I guess would be one question.
Fair, yeah.
Another comment that I really like to think about is this. As a parent, my role is to show my child how I eventually want them to treat themselves. So in a scenario like that, eventually when my child is upset or angry when they're older, what do I want them to do? Do I want them to yell and scream and get angry and get into fights with people? Or do I want them to model what I just showed them? Take a deep breath, talk about what's just happened, and tell a friend maybe what they're struggling with, and feel what I feel, and then move forward. And so the type of parenting that I'm talking about, yes, our approaches are softer and there's no spanking or yelling at your kids, but in every interaction you're having with your child, you're actually teaching them what you want them to eventually do, and what so many of us as adults are trying to teach ourselves to do now, right?
Yeah.
So many adults now, we're going to therapy and we're trying to learn how to be mindful or take deep breaths, and we're just giving those skills to our kids younger. And they learn through repeated exposures to us being their calm, how to take on their own calm, and eventually 30 years from now, not yell and scream at a boss for not listening to them.
Yeah, because that would not be good.
Yes, exactly. And I think a lot of the skepticism that I hear is like, well, their boss is not going to validate their feelings, right? Or, you know, in the real world, things are harsh.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, yeah, for sure. And so we want to give our kids tools to cope with the real world when they're young, like learning how to take a deep breath, learning how to communicate their feelings. I shared a post the other day saying I got my daughter who was having a meltdown a glass of ice water, and I just gave it to her, sat at the table with her. And I hope that someday when she's having a meltdown as an adult and having a hard time, she'll just do the same thing, get herself a glass of ice water and sit and talk to a friend. Does that help?
Yeah. So you're essentially saying that the alternative is far worse than whatever claims these people would make about softness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think.
Because I mean, the point that you made about, you know, hardening these young boys to the point where they grow up and being incapable of communicating and having conversations, it's true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no way to spin that. There's a lot of men out there that are struggling.
Yeah, and what I'd say to anyone who thinks we do need to harden our boys or girls, I'm just saying boys because I know a lot of men listen to this podcast, but I'd ask them why. Like, what part of you feels uncomfortable with raising a child who maybe has a softness or maybe feels like it's okay to cry? And I would really challenge a father or any person who says that we are raising kids that are too soft to say, what makes you uncomfortable with softness? Because I think it often goes down to, again, the reflection and asking ourselves that question.
Interesting. How do you deal with, well, actually, you know what, before I jump to that, how do you then ensure that they still learn to deal with failure without just being like, woe is me, the world is against me, I'm going to express my emotions, sure, great, but then do nothing about it because I feel like I've gotten my outlet. But the, you know, challenges that you come up against your entire life, being able to actually build some level of, I don't know what the word is. Tolerance, thank you.
Yeah. I think that's really important. And I do think that's a part of parenting in this way that I teach that is often missed. A really important thing is helping our children learn how to navigate disappointment. So, for example, the other day I was in Niagara Falls with my kids, and first off, overstimulation nightmare. Never again. But anyway, we went to the water park and we had a day away. And then at the end of the day away, we were going through the Hershey's chocolate store, and like there's this huge sign for milkshakes. And I was not about to spend any more money. Like, I'll just be honest. It's the falls, right? And so we went into the Hershey store with the goal of, we had these coupons. We're going to get these 2 free chocolates, and then we're going home. My 4-year-old sees this milkshake, and her brain is just now stuck on getting this milkshake, right? And so in that scenario, I have 2 options. I can fear her tears and fear her meltdown and say, okay, honey, you're really sad about the milkshake. Okay, we'll buy it. Or I can teach her how to tolerate disappointment and to tolerate something that feels uncomfortable for her. So I say to her, no, we're not here to get a milkshake. I'm not gonna buy the milkshake for you. And she gets really angry and starts crying and melting down, throws a tantrum on the floor. And I have a choice, right? And so in that scenario, I said to her, no, we're not buying the milkshake. And it's okay for you to be upset about that. And this is how our kids learn to tolerate disappointment. And so as she's upset about it, I'm narrating those feelings. I'm allowing the feelings, but I'm setting that boundary. No, we're not buying it. We move out of the store and she's still mad about it, and that's okay. And so I think that that's a piece that we really need to remember when we're talking about parenting without hard punishments, is that part of it is we need to model to our kids how to navigate being disappointed by something. And we need to teach them that it's okay to be uncomfortable by being disappointed about something. And it doesn't mean that we get everything that we want. And I think in parenting, there's tons of opportunities to allow our kids to be disappointed, and that's okay.
I think in those scenarios, the parents almost probably feel the most amount of embarrassment. Like, oh my God, everybody's now looking at me with this child that's losing their mind, screaming and crying and kicking. I look like I don't know how to take care of my own child. That kind of self-internalized commentary going on. But then how do you teach the kid not to resort to that type of tantrum?
Yeah.
Because you can have the conversation with them and eventually get them to a point where they understand it. But then they might be inclined again, like, where's the motivation for the kid to not do that again?
To not have a tantrum.
To not have the tantrum, yeah.
Yeah. Can I just say, I love this line of questioning. Like, I love when someone's skeptical. My husband, he did not grow up with this style of parenting at all. And the first 3 years of parenting were just these questions over and over and over. So I love it. I love it. A few things that we need to know. First, the developing brain. So when I enter into that situation with my 4-year-old, who's also highly sensitive, what I know is when her brain gets stuck on something like that, like the milkshake, she actually does not have the ability to think logically, to control her impulses, or be reasonable. Like that. For me to expect that of her is unrealistic because her brain literally does not have that ability. So I think first off, we need to go in knowing that, especially with our kids under 5. So my job is, if my child doesn't have the ability to think logically, can't control her impulses, I have to act as that for her. So in that situation, she's tired. It's been a long day. We've been at the water park. She also doesn't have a lot of resources to pull from to be calm. I just basically have to act as her logical brain for her. So I have to pick her up off the floor. I have to take her out into the hallway. And I just have to be okay with the fact that, you know what? People are maybe going to look at me and maybe they're going to judge me and think I'm a soft parent. And I have to say, you know what? Those are your feelings. My job right now is to solely take care of my child. So I do a lot of that in my work, is just imagining, okay, that's your feeling. I'm just going to give that back to you. It's not on me. If you don't like what I'm doing, then that's fine. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing is, we know that it takes repeated exposures to a parent being calm for a child to learn how to take that calm on themselves. So my 7-year-old, we're in the store. She also wants a milkshake, but she has had repeated exposures to me being her calm the same way I navigated my 4-year-old. And she knows now how to take that on for herself. So she just says, I really want a milkshake. I wish I could have one, and just moves on because she now has learned how to navigate disappointment.
Right.
And at 7, that's actually pretty impressive that she can say that. Yeah. Usually we'd say that, do that a little later. And I mean, a lot of adults don't even know how to navigate disappointment. Yeah. Oh, my 7-year-old is wise. She's wiser than me. She's very wise. But she can handle disappointment and she can talk out how she feels. So to answer your question, like, when can we expect them to take that on? We can expect them to be logical and reasonable. I guess the amount that we've also tried to act as that part of their brain for them. And then around 5 to 7, we'll see that shift where they can start to not have those huge meltdowns in the store. But it does take a lot of time and it's not a quick fix.
How do you deal with bullying?
Ooh.
I saw a post the other day by someone who said, bring bullying back because kids are too soft these days. And I thought that was a really stupid comment.
Yeah.
But it also got me thinking, you know, I've had times as a kid where I was bullied. I've witnessed bullying. Never been the bully. I'm proud to be able to say that. And I know, even to this day, I don't know if I know how to advise someone, or if I had a kid, how to help them navigate something like that, because it's extremely traumatizing.
Yeah.
Can really scar a kid and could really make for an unpleasant childhood experience, which then I'm confident in saying it'll follow them through the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
How do you be there as a parent for your kid, especially when those parental instincts kick in and you're like, that's my kid that's being bullied. You want to go kick that other kid's ass, which you shouldn't, obviously, but you, like that, those instincts come through.
Yeah. Whenever I get asked a lot about bullying, and I've dealt with a lot of children who were bullied, and I always think back to this experience that I had as a child, where there was someone in my life who was bullying me and who was not nice to me, and every time I saw her, she was mean. But when I got to go home, my parents were there and they were safe. And so I had a relief from the bullying, and I had a sense of being worthy and being lovable because I had a good relationship with my parents. And so the first thing I'd advise to parents is be that safe relationship for your kids. And if a child gets bullied at school or wherever they are, and they come home and they know that they're loved, they can talk to their parents, that they are safe, that is a huge protective factor for our kids. With my own daughter, she was experiencing some bullying on the bus. She takes a bus to school, and I just feel like the bus is a whole other world, and lots of things happen on the bus that we don't know. But when she was bullied the first day, she came home and she told us right away. And the reason that she felt comfortable telling us is because she knows what it feels like to be in a safe relationship. So she was telling us, like, I can't believe she said this to me. How could someone say that? That's so awful. It's so terrible that she could say that to me. It was like, good that you know that that's terrible, because that means that when you're home and you're with us, you've now learned what it's like to be safe.
Okay.
So I think the first thing we can do as parents is try and not be our child's bully and try and be safe to them. And then I think we want to really give them the confidence and ability to stand up for themselves, to stand up for others, and also know that it's okay to sometimes you have to interject. Like there was a time when the bullying on the bus was getting pretty bad, and I had to call the principal and be like, look, this is what's happening. It's not okay. And how can we make sure that this doesn't keep happening? And I think it's okay for parents to know that they're their child's best advocate and they can stand up for them too.
Yeah. What happens if that safety is never a thing for a child? That coming home, that safety blanket, knowing that your parents are there for you. And, you know, it could be because of intentional neglect or unintentional, right? It can go both ways. But how does that affect a child growing up into their teens and into adulthood?
Yeah, it can affect children in many different ways. I think when we're home, we have the message that home is not safe. We're learning the message that the world is not safe. So we're learning the message that when I'm in the world, I can't rely on other people and I don't have the ability to trust. So I think it can come in issues with trust. It can come in issues with forming relationships with people who are not safe. So we learn how to be in relationship with other people in our lives through the relationship that we have with our parents or trusted caregivers if your parents aren't there. So a child who grows up with a really toxic relationship with their parents, they don't have the ability to communicate how they feel with their parents. They don't have that safety. As they get older, they don't know now how to have that safety and healthy relationships with other people in their life. So we might see that child be the one to have really toxic friendships with people. We might see that child as the one who's bullying, because they have not learned the skills to be in relationship. And that's why relationship in those early years is the most important thing that we can have. And I know a lot of adults now that we work with at our practice, they're learning how to be in relationship for the first time, right? Like we're learning how to communicate, how to speak out what we feel, because we didn't have the ability to do that as kids. So it can come out in a lot of ways. It can come out in toxic friendships, difficult time in relationships. It can come out in a lack of trust for the world and trying to be really independent when really we all need togetherness. Like we need community.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. I'm just curious now, if you're a product of that kind of environment and you're an adult now, and you have enough self-awareness to know that these things had affected you growing up, and now you find yourself in a position where you are a parent, how do you not pass that along? How do you break that cycle? Because I think there's a lot of people out there who constantly say, you know, when I have a kid, these are the things I'm not going to do
Yeah.
that my parents did, or these are the things I'm going to do that my parents did. And then somehow in there seeps in the negatives that also came with it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, if you're a parent listening to this and you're watching this and thinking that, what advice would you share with them?
Yeah. There's something that we talk about often, and it's the process of reparenting. So I don't know, have you heard of that
No, I
term?
haven't,
Okay.
actually.
Oh, this is exciting. One of my favorite things to talk about. It's the process of imagining yourself as a younger child,
Mm-hmm.
and what did you need when you were a child, and now you are giving yourself what you needed when you were a kid. So for example, if when you were a kid, I'll give you an example. So my husband, as I mentioned, he grew up in a very abusive household. So when he was a kid, there was things that he didn't have. Like he didn't have the time to play because he was taking care of his siblings. So part of his reparenting journey, which is giving himself now, his adult self, what he needed when he was a kid, is to learn how to play again, right? He never had that as a kid. So, okay, how are you, a person in your 30s, going to learn how to play for the first time in your life, right? So then for him, it's thinking, okay, so what are those things that I did enjoy when I was a kid? Maybe I didn't have a lot of time for play, but what did I enjoy? Okay, one of the things he enjoyed was playing Mario Kart with his cousins. Okay, so how can we lean into that and find a piece of play for yourself now? So now he refurbishes old video games, and
That's so cool.
he collects them, and we have this whole shelf in our house full of old video games that he refurbishes, and we'll have friends over with their kids and we'll play it together. And there's a piece of that that's healing.
Yeah.
Reparenting is also giving yourself time to reflect on those triggers. So when your kids are yelling at you and you just want to yell back at them, it's asking yourself, okay, well, what part of me wants to yell back at my kids? Why do I want to yell? And it's imagining, okay, when I was a kid and I yelled at my parents, my dad would yell back at me, right? My dad would, and I'm not saying my dad, but in general, like my dad would yell. So when my kid yells at me, I immediately am triggered back to that memory. And I think, this kid yelling, that's bad. I have to yell back at them.
Yeah.
So reparenting is the process of reflecting on that little version of yourself, what they needed, and trying to give it to them now yourself. And it can be really healing.
How do you, if I'm going to actually use you and your husband as an example,
Please,
if I may.
yeah.
You talked about how he grew up in a very different environment, and some of that comes through as he became a parent,
Yeah.
versus your reality as a child and how you parent. When you've got a couple with two very distinctively different parenting styles, how do you broker something in the middle for the sake of the kids?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think so many couples struggle with that. I think for us, maybe it's a little bit different because I'm a therapist who specializes in working with kids, right? So I think when we first
You have an unfair advantage.
I have an unfair advantage. And my husband, when we became parents, he knew he did not want to pass on his traumas to his kids. He knew that. But what he didn't know was how triggering for those old wounds becoming a parent would be. Because a lot of his childhood he hadn't really processed yet. And then all of a sudden you have this beautiful baby sitting in front of you. You're like, how could someone hurt a child this way?
Yeah.
Right? And that's really upsetting and hard. And I think for him, like we had talked about, underneath anger is sadness. And so I think for him in those early years of parenting was finding that sadness for the first time. And that was difficult for him, but also quite a powerful journey. And we did therapy together, and that really helped. Of course, I'm biased against therapy because I'm a therapist. But, and then I think in that work of reflecting on, well, why am I so triggered? Because of all these things that have happened to me, he was able to realize how he wanted to do things different. And for him, like when he learned things like the brain science for toddlers and that they aren't bad, they just don't have the ability to control their impulses. He's also one to get very passionate. And then he's like, I need to tell everyone I know that, like, how did I not know this? And he would stand up for toddlers and be, if he heard someone talking about it, he's like, they just don't know. They just don't have impulse control yet. So I think for him, it actually made him really passionate about parenting in this type of way. He actually runs Nurtured First with me now, left his engineering career to do this.
Very
so
cool.
Yeah, interesting story. So I think for him, I always even though he grew up in a very different way, he had a passion for wanting to do things different. So we very much became aligned, even though it was hard in the early years.
You mentioned something along the lines of nature versus nurture.
Mm-hmm.
How does where are we with that debate, if that's even a debate still?
Yeah, I love that question. Okay, well, there's a few things. There is a part of nature. So some children are born with different temperaments.
Mm-hmm.
I have a child who was born with a more slow to warm, sensitive temperament. She feels the world very deeply. She takes on others' emotions, lights, sounds. They can all become a lot for her.
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 other daughters who were born with a mild temperament. That means that they're just naturally more easygoing from birth.
Mm-hmm.
So there is temperament, and kids are born with different temperaments, and we can see that. Like parents will always say, I have multiple kids and they're so different. That's because we're born with different temperaments.
Mm-hmm.
But then there is the nurture piece, and that's a big piece of parenting is, does your child learn at an early age that they're safe with you, that they can fall back on your relationship? Because if they learn that at an early age, they are going to do so much better throughout their life because they are secure and they're safe at home. So they can tolerate disappointment in the world. They can tolerate a bully at school. They can tolerate not doing well on a test because they have that relationship to fall back on. So both are true. There's an element of nature and there's a very big element of nurture. So I think we do have to look at both.
So in that scenario, as you were talking, I was immediately thinking of, the unpleasant folk in society who've committed heinous crimes, let's say. Is it a cop-out to say that it was part of their nurturing, or can people just can people's temperament just be that off to the spectrum, to that side of the spectrum?
I think if you look at anyone who has committed terrible crimes or who have really struggled to be kind to others throughout their life, you can almost always go back to their childhood and see that there was some sort of maybe attachment issue or some sort of trauma that happened to them and that they were hurt in their childhoods. And I think that there's research to be able to back that up as well, that people who, people who are addicted or who are in jail, and I worked with a lot of those kids. I worked with kids who were on the street and needed to go to jail at a very, very young age. And every single one of them had complex trauma in their childhood. And it started really early, and they learned that the world is not safe. I have to take care of myself. I have to do so by any means necessary. And you know what? I actually have to put my defenses up so high that I cannot love anyone or be kind to anyone because that could be more painful to me.
Can you break through that?
As a therapist?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that you can. I do think that there's hope for anyone. I think the more you've been through and the less safety that you've felt as a child, it takes more time.
Right.
But even if I think about my husband, and I know I brought him up a few times, but when we're talking about reparenting, I was right beside him through every part of that story. And to go from a child who doesn't have that relationship with his mother and who has been through a lot of trauma that he went through, lost his grandfather to suicide while he was there at the house, like a lot of really complex trauma, to come out the other side and have a loving, very secure attachment with your 3 kids. Like, I think that's a story of it can be done. And it was hard work. Every day he had to think about, why am I so triggered? What's going on? How can I repair and connect with my children? How do I form a relationship with my children? So it was something that he had to think about every single day. And it was hard work, but I do think it can be done.
You talked about, and I'm very sorry to hear that, about him witnessing his grandfather that way. But now I feel like I need to ask you about suicide in general. And to anyone listening, watching, I highly encourage you seek out any kind of support for that. But I had recently come across, I don't know if it was a news posting, a report, something that talked about a rise in suicide amongst teens and young adults. What's happening there? Why is there such a big shift in that direction? Like that, those are scary numbers that we're starting to see.
Yeah, I think we're having a real mental health crisis for our teens and youth right now. I think there's a lot of factors. I think we had teens and youth go through a pandemic and not be together. And if we look at one of the core needs that we all have as humans is togetherness and closeness and feeling relationship and connection. And for our teens, they went through, let's say, 3 years of a pandemic where they couldn't have that closeness. And for a lot of the teens, if we go back to what's most important for a child is that secure relationship with their parents, not only did they not get that closeness with maybe peers or teachers or other people, but a lot of them were home with parents who were not safe to them and parents who were stressed and trying to work from home and navigate their children. So I think that's one big piece is a lot of children and teens were home and they maybe didn't have that safe home environment and they didn't have those outlets of those other safe people in their life. And that's really difficult. And then I think if we push it even further, we look at social media and we look at this false sense of closeness that they're getting. So, you know, you can scroll TikTok for hours, but you don't leave TikTok the same way you leave a coffee date with a friend who bears their soul to you and you can actually have that connection. So I think teens right now and even young adults in general, we have a lot of access to social media. It gives us a false sense of, oh, I've seen people, but we're not actually ever getting that closeness that we need. And so we're walking through life feeling more alone than ever. And I think when we feel alone, we don't have that connection, we don't have that community, we don't have that relationship, it leaves us with mental health issues and struggles. And I get the sense that that's happening a lot to the teens today.
How do we help? How do we, I don't even know, what, can you reverse the course on this? Can you like shift this, this spike and curve it a little bit? Like what could we do?
I think something that we can do that's really underrated and but very, very powerful is relationship. So if you have a teen in your life or a child in your life who's struggling, the number one thing we can do is build a relationship. And there is research on that for kids who grew up in traumatic homes or teens. One solid relationship is a huge protective factor for the rest of their lives. And you talk to children who have been through some of the most traumatic stuff. Like, for example, my husband, that he had like a few solid relationships with adults in his life. And I think that that was the saving grace. And so I think if you see a teen who's struggling, how can you form a relationship with them? How can you take them out for coffee? Can you play a game that they enjoy with them? Like if they're stuck gaming all the time, like can you just sit next to them, get to know the game and play with them? If we can form relationship, we can really change lives that way. And then, of course, on top of that, making sure that they get the professional support that they need.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I think there's still a bit of a stigma and a taboo around seeking out professional help.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember a time when I used to think the only people that went to therapy were crazy people. And like,
where do you think that message came from?
Friends, family, culture.
Yeah.
A lot of it from society. I mean, as a guy growing up, you're already told, like you said, don't express the emotions, let alone go and talk to a therapist who's going to sit there and poke and prod at you, and everyone else is going to be like, oh, that's Samir. He goes and he talks to a therapist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I could only imagine still what people feel and go through in that regard. And as you were talking about the pandemic, it had me thinking about another report I'd seen about kids who had to mask for so long that they were afraid to take it off because they didn't know how to interact, seeing people's faces and reactions. Like they didn't know how to process the emotions. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on how we help kids in the post-pandemic world, the ones who spent maybe what would have been the first 2-3 years of their schooling indoors, locked away, virtual, masked, etc. And then the teens, that you talked about not having that connection anymore. How do we, or what kind of impact is that going to leave if we leave it untreated?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It goes back again to relationship, like you said. You were saying those kids didn't have chances to build that relationship, right? So whether that relationship was with their teacher, their peers, I think the kids that are going to do best are the kids that when they were home with their parents, they were able to build that solid relationship, even if it was imperfect. I mean, I was a parent in the pandemic. I had two babies in the pandemic, and my oldest missed out on her first year and a half of school. So I can relate to parents, and I know how hard that was. And so I want to give parents the grace to say, when I say build a relationship with your kids, it doesn't mean you have to do it perfectly. There's plenty of times I lost my cool, but I came back and repaired. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do as a parent. But I think if we look at the kids who have gone through that, I think the ones who can still fall back on that relationship with their parent, those are probably the kids that are going to be able to do the best and get back into society.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we can do as parents. So if you see your kid really struggling, if they're struggling so much and you see them, they're using, let's say, gaming as a way to cope. How can you join their world? How can you try and understand, okay, well, what is it about gaming that you like? Is it the fact that you're talking to your friends online? Is it the fact that you can kind of zone out and game for a little while? Like what is it about that you like?
Yeah.
If your child's struggling, maybe it's setting up a weekly coffee date where you just get to know them and you just ask them how school's going. Things like that will be the way that we can best support our child. And through that relationship with us, they learn those social skills so that they feel more confident going out with their friends.
Amazing. One final question.
Okay.
What advice would you give to brand new parents? Either they just had their kid or their kid's on the way. What advice would you give them?
Oh, I'd give them the advice of give yourself so much compassion. I remember when I first became a mom, like I told you, I was already a child therapist. I had worked with kids with complex behavior. I'm like, I've got this. This is going to be easy. This is going to be good for me. Like, finally, I can put all my tools into practice. And it was still really, really hard, like alarmingly hard.
Right.
I struggled with postpartum anxiety and depression, and my husband was going through all this trauma from his past, and the both of us were like, oh my goodness, this is not what we expected.
Yeah.
And the one thing that really got me through was the ability to be self-compassionate and say, okay, this feels hard because it is hard, and that's okay. It's not always going to be this hard. And giving myself that compassion and grace for repairing with my child when I did lose my cool or things were tough, I think that really helped get us through and get us to a point where it didn't feel quite so hard every single day.
Amazing. Jess, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
I learned a ton.
Good.
And we have to do a part 2.
Yes, I would love that.
This is incredible. Where can people find you?
You can find me on at Nurtured First on Instagram. That's where I spend most of my days hanging out, doing stories, doing posts, talking about all of this stuff. So please come find me there. You can also find us on our website, nurturedfirst.com. We have an amazing blog that's just filled with tips and tools and deeper reflections to help you understand parenting more. So you can find us there as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This was helpful. I hope this was helpful to you listening, watching, and make sure to check Jess out. She's incredibly talented, insightful, and I've learned a ton. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much, everybody.